Hello everyone, my name is J.D. Cochran, the clinical supervisor here at the Piedmont Atlanta Echo Lab. Today I'm going to be showcasing the SC2000, how to process and acquire speckle tracking strain imaging. Starting off, there's some important points on the machine for imaging strain that you want to make note of. First, your spatial resolution, so you can see over here spatial time. Most imaging is done in T1 for normal scans. T1 imaging gives you better temporal resolution, which on the actual screen and the actual image basically gives you a smoother image. When you're doing speckle tracking, you actually want to change this down to, it's a simple twist of the knob here, down to S1 imaging. S1, in fact, is more of a spatial acquisition, and what that does to the 2D picture is actually brings out the speckles of the image to allow for the machine to, in fact, pick up and track the speckles on the 2D image. So S1 imaging. Now, to offset what happens, and I'll show you here at the top of the machine, you can see in S1 our frames per second are down to 51. When I go back to T1 imaging, you can see our frame rates increase from 51 to 68. So what happens when you go down to this S1 or spatial imaging, you lose frame rates. So to offset the loss of frame rates, we'll talk about what you have to optimize your picture by dropping your depth and decreasing your depth and narrowing your B mode sector. And we'll show some examples of that. Another important factor that plays a part in acquiring strain images on the SC2000 is you must have an EKG signal, and you must have a clean EKG signal. So we were now in S1, as you can see. We were probes on our patient, and we would then freeze the image to retrospectively acquire. As you can see, we have no EKG. The other important thing you have to turn on is the extended R to R interval, but without an EKG there is no R to R interval. So once we hook our patient up to our EKG, you'll see a nice, clean, no artifact EKG, and that is exactly what you want to do. So then, once we freeze this image, allowing for about 3 or 4 beats to pass, we can then see some options come up here to the left side of your screen. The extended R to R is originally off, and we can turn it on. Now, we'll look here at the EKG and see what actually happens when we turn the extended R to R on. So the extended R to R is currently off. The white line here is marking the number of beats and the cycles that you are going to currently acquire. The purple lines here are the machine marking what is in diastole and in systole. So by turning on the extended R to R, we can watch our white lines have now extended a little bit past the start of the QRS and then a little bit past the end of the QRS. Now this allows for us to actually process all 3 beats here when processing strain. If we turn this extended R to R off, we were to go into acquire and process this data set, you would actually only process 2 of these cardiac cycles because you don't have enough information here. So another important notation about the extended R to R interval, if you are in a lab where your machine is stationary and is turned on once in the morning and does not get shut off until the end of the day, if you turn this extended R to R on once without booting down the machine, it will continue to stay on for the rest of your exams. On the contrary, if you are taking this machine portable and doing bedside exams, every time you boot down the machine and then boot it back up, you will have to remember to turn this extended R to R interval on. The other equally, if not actually more important piece of this acquisition process is the freeze and retrospective acquisition. If you were to prospectively acquire like you're used to doing for normal imaging, you actually will decrease the amount of frames per second versus if you were to allow for the image to play for about 3 to 4 cardiac cycles, freeze the image, and then retrospectively acquire, it'll actually increase and keep the same number of frames per second instead of decreasing when you prospectively acquire. One other important piece to note when you're trying to optimize for your frames per second is pay attention to your frequency. Now on the SC2000s with the standard 4V1C probe, the max frequency for this imaging probe in harmonics is 4.3. Now 4.3 sometimes can be very nice, but in some patients with slightly challenging windows, 4.3 is a little bit too much and not enough penetration. So other important thing to pay attention to, if you have a beautiful image but you can't seem to get your frame rates where we need them to be, we can also decrease the frequency one and see going down to just simply 4 from 4.3. We have just slightly increased our frame rates from about 51 to 56. The problem is, many SC2000 users may know, I can continue to drop my frequency here by toggling down, and I'll continue to increase my frames per second. However, once you get to about 3 megahertz or even 2.25, the quality of the 2D image is degraded so much that processing strain at that point can be very challenging. So for the most part, in general, I would say try to stick to an frequency of about 4 to 4.3. The frames per second that we are trying to ideally acquire these strain images are between 70 and 90 frames per second. Another fun notation just to pick up on is the patient's heart rate. If the patient's heart rate is tachycardic and over 100, it is not ideal to try to process strain. The opposite, ideally you want your frame rates to ideally match or exceed slightly your heart rate. So if you have a patient whose heart rate is about 90, you ideally want to get your frame rates as close to 90 as possible. Now we have a patient we have acquired strain on. So in this image here, we can see a few notations that we just pointed out before. We have made sure that our extended R to R is turned on. You can tell this by the white lines not being directly on the QRS. We still have our purple lines here marking the in diastole and in systole. In this particular image, we can pay attention to our frames per second, ideally again being between 70 and 90 frames per second. Also making note that our frames here of 71 are just slightly higher or equal to our beats per minute. The patient's heart rate at 65 to 67. We have the frequency at 4.3, which again is our highest imaging frequency on this particular probe. But the image quality was adequate enough that we did not need to drop our frequency down to 4. You can see here we acquired this in S1 imaging in a freeze and retrospective acquisition. So again, as we said, when you change your spatial resolution to S1, this in fact decreases your frames per second. And you can see on the image what we did was we decreased our depth, cutting off some of the left atrium, and then also decreasing our 2D sector, not too much to exclude some of the apex, and not too much to where we're cutting into the lateral wall. So you want to be careful of those two things. The other very important piece of this acquisition that you want to make note of is the lack of foreshortening. So by foreshortening your left ventricle, you in fact will then overestimate your strain, your global longitudinal strain. The other important thing is when you're going to acquire your strain images, you ideally want to acquire all 3 of your apical windows in a sequence of 4, 2, and 3. Ideally, you want to do that all back to back, so that way your gain settings, your depth settings, and your imaging frequencies are all the same. Ideally, when you're also acquiring an image for strain, you would like to increase your gain a slight bit more than you would for the normal 2D images. From here, we will now freeze this image and come down, and you can see here to the next key, which is just right of our trackball. We'll click this. By clicking this on the image or on the thumbnails, we can launch into, by clicking the right or the left button, select, can launch into VVI. VVI is velocity vector imaging. So now we have some options over here onto the left side of the screen, basically allowing us to plot our contours depending on the view that we're currently looking at, whether it's a 4-chamber, 2, or 3, or if you were getting into your circumferentials. Another important thing is the setup. Setup allows you to launch in and adjust in certain patients who may in fact have a widened or abnormal EKG or QRS signal. The gamma here is defaulted to 25, and say we have an image where it doesn't appear as bright or overgained as we may have thought when we initially acquired it. You can come to the gamma here and decrease the gamma, and as you see, as we decrease the gamma down, our overall 2D image increases in 2D gain. We can take our trackball here and slowly scroll through. Now, the nice thing of strain does not really matter what part of the cardiac cycle that you do the placing of the contours. However, my personal preference is to go just a touch into systole, so that way I can watch the endocardial muscle movement. We'll come over here to the left side of the screen, being that this is a 4-chamber image, and we'll simply click on our select. Now coming over here back to the image, you can see our pointer has now changed to cross. You will then simply hit select at the points to drop the contours around the left ventricle. And when we do that, we would like to place a minimum of 5 to 6 contours, maximum of 5 to 6 contours. Reason being, the less number of contours that you place allows for the machine to process. So if by placing too many contours, you're actually overloading the system with information. So when we're placing the contours, you want to place by again clicking select, and then at the base we'll go mid-ventricle, hit select again, we'll go to the apex, select, back down to about mid-lateral wall, select, and when we get to our final point down here to the other base, we will then hit next to complete. And once you note down here on the image, once you have completed your placement of the contours, the option now of the next button turns into track. So if we come back up here and we simply hit the next button, it will then track for us. Now many people will say, well, JD, this looks odd. We're not even on the endocardium here or here. That is correct. However, the machine will correct this for us. The other important notation here is that we are placing these contour points on the endocardium and not further out into the muscle on the mid-muscular or epicardial layer, because the endocardial layer, we use endocardial speckle tracking to process strain, but the endocardial layer of the myocardium is predominantly made up of your longitudinal fibers, As you get further into the mid-muscle or even to the epicardial layer, that is predominantly made up of your circumferential fibers. So we have placed our contours now. We're going to simply click on the next button, allow the machine to automatically track this strain. Usually takes a few seconds for the machine to process this data. Once it has processed, you will then see the display here. Now, we will then just simply freeze this image. And what is all this information first? We have some new options over here to the right. We have a bunch of arrows flashing all around. These arrows are the endocardial vectors, showing both the direction, and the length of the arrow is actually telling us the velocity and the intensity of the strain. For the purposes now, we're going to turn the endocardial vectors off. Why are we turning the endocardial vectors off? Well, we're allowing it to now be able to see this solid line, so we can then hit start stop here or here on the keyboard, and that allows us to see the image and see what in fact it is tracking. So if we want to then say we don't believe the tracking, and we do believe the tracking, or we want to simply make a small adjustment to this image, we would simply freeze, come over here to the contour, and you can freeze wherever you think the image is off, or you can simply go to the contour here. And as you can see, we're back to where we were with the contour points, and you can also see that the machine has, as I said, automatically filled in the points in between. So we can just simply scroll through looking to see where we don't believe or where we want to make some minor adjustments to this. And you can really see, even though it's slightly off from the endocardium, it actually is moving fairly well. But we'll make some subtle adjustments here, bringing this point out, and that's a simple right click on the green dots, and then we'll bring these slightly out, so it's a single click to grab, and then just a slight movement. Single click to grab and slight movement. Once you've finished making any adjustments to your contours, you can then again come to the middle of the screen and simply hit track here again and allow it to reprocess your adjustments. One question that may come up is, how many times do I attempt to process data? It's a very good question. The notation in our lab is, after you have tried to process the data 3 different times, we move on. So we've processed this data and say we accept and we like the data. We would simply come over to the endocardial vectors. We can turn them off. So this would be the first image that we would acquire, assuming we liked it, and this would be a live acquisition here. This would also be the exact same image we would acquire if we did not believe or did not like the tracking. Now this image allows us, the reason we acquire this if we don't believe, it allows us to prove to our readers that we in fact attempted strain on this patient, and gives them the opportunity to realize why we did not further process or show any other data, because we didn't believe the tracking. So we would then come over here to some different options. This is where we're currently at, velocity vectors, and then we come over to our segmental page. So coming to our segmental page, we would, if we believe the data, we would acquire this as a live image. Now, reporting wise, the GLS number here of 14.7 is the number in fact that we will be using to report. You can see in the upgraded software version we have a couple other numbers here on the screen. So this number down here with the S is the segmental number. What that means is these individual segments representing segmental areas of the muscle are all averaged together to come up with this number. So if I were to delete, simply come over and right click with the select button and delete this segment, in fact it would change our segmental value, but if you note that it does not change our global longitudinal value. So again, if I take the apex out for whatever reason, you see then our segmental value changes to 15 from 17, but again the 14.7 never changes. The difference is the GLS number at the top is an equation based upon the length of the LV during systole and the length of the LV during diastole, and is not made up of these segmental numbers. So therefore, by excluding any particular segment, it does not change your global longitudinal number. This number was given by the ASE and European Society as the reference number we should use between the different vendors, because that algorithm does not change between the different vendors. You'll see this other number beside the C. This number is the average of your linear curves here. You can see it here on the multi-dotted yellow line, and it's the average of all the different peaks averaged together. Most of the time, this segmental number here, your curve number and your GLS are generally speaking very similar. Usually when your segmental number and your GLS number are different is when you have poor tracking or a segmental wall motion abnormality, and those would be the times where the numbers would be a bit off. So we're going to say we like this acquisition. We would acquire this as a live acquisition here. Once that acquires, we would come back to the display options here, and we would acquire a live image of this. Now we're going to do that for all three, the processing for the 2-chamber, the 3-chamber, and the 4-chamber is all the same. We are going to go through and acquire here. We're going to process our 2-chamber, again acquiring the segmental number here. We're going to acquire the tracking to prove that in fact it is or isn't tracking properly. And then again in the 3-chamber with the segmental. Now once you've acquired and processed all three of these views, your final number or final image would be your bullseye. The bullseye is not meant on these machines for reporting, because the bullseye is made up of the individual segmental numbers, which is more of a vendor specific, and it is considered peak systolic strain. And the peak systolic strain is an average of all the individual segments, and then also on the Siemens SC2000 carts is an average of all three beats from all three views. So this segmental bullseye is purely for pattern recognition. On the 6.0 carts, this pattern becomes similar to what you're used to seeing on some of the GE or Philips carts with the blue and red. Currently on the Siemens carts, it's different variations of purple. So darker purples, like here, seen here and seen here, are more negative values, versus lighter purples into pinks are a more positive strain value. So you can still have somewhat of the same pattern recognition, just in a different color format. Some questions that would come up for reporting also would be in Singo. You would actually manually pull up your worksheet in Singo and manually type in each view into the worksheet. So GLS on the 4-chamber would be negative 20.4. 2-chamber you would type in the single worksheet 22.9, and then in the 3, 19.3, and single would then average those for you. A few other questions that have come up. We've already touched on the R2R, reason for R2R retrospective capture. So can you turn on the R2R without an EKG? And the answer, as we saw, was no. You must have a EKG in order to turn on your R2R intervals. Why should we acquire apical images consecutively? Well, as we also stated, acquiring the images consecutively allows for both consecutive heart rates at the similar or same gain settings, depth settings, and sector settings. That way the least variability between all three views. And then how does heart rate affect strain, and which rhythms should strain not be processed? So heart rate, as we also talked about, anything that's tachycardic or over 100 beats per minute, ideally you would not want to process strain on those patients. You can acquire the data in the rare situation where you're comparing serial exams. You can acquire the data but would not routinely process. And in specific rhythms, such as atrial fibrillation, PVCs, ectopic beats that are in a pattern of bigeminy. Again, for bigeminy, trigeminy, you would not really want to acquire or process any of that data unless, and same with strain, for AFib, unless you can get the patient's heart rate to an ideal consistent R2R interval without a PVC or PAC that affects it. If you cannot do that, or cannot get a patient who's has any sort of consistency in their R2R interval who's in AFib, then you do not want to acquire, do not process strain on those patients. Again, we've touched on the reason for plotting only 5 to 6 contours for GLS. By doing more than 5 to 6 contour points on the Siemens software, it actually overloads the system and doesn't capture or track very well. The number of attempts that you want to attempt in processing strain, if it does not track well, is a maximum of 3. If, in fact, this is a very important patient that needs, or ideally you think needs, a patient needs strain processing done on this patient, and it's not tracking or not doing something correctly, the thing I would suggest is first, don't let the patient leave just yet. Go ask a senior sonographer or a fellow coworker to come and take a look. Sometimes this could be purely because of the image quality, and see if another sonographer can attempt to put their hands on the probe and acquire a different data set. Sometimes this could be probably because of a poor EKG signal, or again, in essence, could be that the patient image quality is just too degraded to track. So those would be my suggestions if strain was not tracking properly. And then the last question would be, should we suppress the apex? And as we showed you in this data set here, that by suppressing the apex, it actually in fact does not affect your global longitudinal strain value that we should be reporting, but only affects the segmental. So there is really no purpose of deleting or excluding or suppressing any of the individual segments. Thank you for your time. Hope you found this video helpful and useful. Please feel free to reach out to myself or Teresa Green if you have further questions. Thank you.